Hi, I'm Lucy Faye, and something tells me I'm gonna sound kinda snobby in this episode. I'm gonna talk about things like normies and the general public in a derogatory term, so please bear with me. Forrest Gump, directed by Robert Zemeckis, is an iconic movie. There's no better way of describing it. For anyone who hasn't seen it, it's about a mildly disabled man living in America between the 1950s and the early 1980s and the wild historical adventure he goes on. It is considered an absolute American classic. It won multiple Oscars, including Best Picture, where it beat out Quiz Show, Shawshank Redemption, and Pulp Fiction, as well as The Usual Suspects and Natural Born Killers, though those two weren't even nominated. It's loved. Every aspect of it is looked up to throughout pop culture, from the soundtrack to the writing to Tom Hanks' performance. It is an extremely influential, heavily referenced movie, and I'm confused. No aspect of Forrest Gump made me want to watch it again, recommend it to someone, nor even really think about it ever again. Forrest Gump somehow manages to feel both too long and terribly underdeveloped. It's nearly 2.5 hours long, and I felt it needed at least another hour to better flesh out every character, relationship, and historical event. You can blame my attention span, but I'ma blame the poor character construction and the lack of both depth and forethought. Now, a problem I always have with watching a movie that came out years before I was born is I'm never gonna get what was meant to be got from this movie. And so some movies aren't going to hit like they would have had I seen them when they were originally in theaters. There's no way to make a movie timeless. Some just do it. It's a happy accident. For a movie to both fit its time to a degree that it keeps its acclaim for generations to come, and then bring something other than its original acclaim forward through the generations is remarkable. That sentence is sort of confusing, so let me give you an example. Lawrence of Arabia is a very famous film that many have called a masterpiece. When it came out, it had massive success and gained huge renown and influenced a shit ton of the most famous Western directors that lived during around the time of its release. A young person, like myself, does not have the right to call this movie bad upon first viewing in 2020. Because yeah, it's 4 hours long with actors I've never heard of and a director for whom I'm utterly unfamiliar. It takes place in a desert during World War II and it's 4 hours long. If I watch it, I won't be engaged with it, but I can learn from it and try to understand it and appreciate it, because it's a masterpiece that I don't have the right frame of reference for. It'll just be long and boring and confusing. This movie is iconic, but not timeless. The Wizard of Oz is timeless, and it being a musical definitely helps that classification. The Wizard of Oz came out in 1939, and I don't know a single person my age who isn't very familiar with that movie. It's an hour 40, has probably the most well-known actress besides Marilyn Monroe starring, has catchy songs that are everywhere, and a really interesting, well-documented production history that, if you're someone like me, can replace the mysticism this movie gives you as a child. It makes it more than a children's movie because while it is entertaining for all ages, it's also this beautiful time capsule of a interesting, complicated period of American history. So it's full of this important pop cultural trivia. Forrest Gump is not timeless. I don't know why it's made it this far. When it came out, the original critical consensus was overwhelmingly positive. Now, there are many articles written about why Forrest Gump does not live up to its renown in the 2010s. What I'm trying to say is I understand if you watched this movie when it came out and loved it, and hold that love for it. We are different people with different experiences and perspectives. But if you watch this movie for the first time after, 2010 and hold a different opinion than me, you probably just didn't watch the movie right, and your opinion is bad. I have many gripes with this movie, but I guess the best one to transition from timelessness to overall critiques is I like biopics and biographies and history in general a lot. All the books I've read recently or currently reading are biographical or historical. It's kind of my bread and butter. So much of this movie is about an average man who's a little more naive than most, living through some of the most influential moments during an iconic, highly studied transitional period in American history. So why are we looking at this fascinating time period from the perspective of a man who is absolutely blank? Forrest Gump is void of outlook or opinion or struggles, which I know is kind of a bold statement, but how I saw it, all of his so-called struggles were either overcome or, when you look at them in comparison to the struggles of the average woman or non-white man at the time, weren't that bad to begin with. A lot of people his age born with actual mental disabilities slightly more severe than his own would be institutionalized at a time when scientists were barely starting to use medication, when electroshock therapy and heroin trials and lobotomies were still commonplace. Never mind that people with severe mental illnesses were barely even considered human. On the topic of heroin trials, an estimated 34% of Vietnam soldiers were given heroin during their time overseas, whether it was to cope with stress or to numb pain. So this caused a big fucking problem for soldiers, especially ones who were fucking drafted, of which Forrest Gump was not, who came home to a country that did not want them or care about them, with life-altering wounds both externally and internally. They had no money and no governmental support, and now an addiction on top of all of that. What my rant comes down to is Forrest Gump is the most boring character to follow through one of the most tumultuous periods of American history. And I know there are movies that cover these more important people, and this movie's special because it doesn't have cynicism or insight. I suppose now it's worth mentioning that I absolutely hated the scenes with John Lennon and Elvis. Oh my god, they were so cheesy. I hated it. Every side character in this movie has a story I'd far rather hear than that of Forrest Gump. Moving on. I guess the other major gripe I have with this movie, which is what really shocked me when I read old reviews of this movie written by super acclaimed critics who failed to mention this intrinsically present flaw, and that is the narration. One of the most heavily referenced parts of this film, I can't stand. Setting aside the fact that I get peeved when a geographical dialect or accent is used to add texture or atmosphere to a movie, I always see it as lazy, but Forrest Gump has the most lines of dialogue of any character in this movie. He's the protagonist, and he also narrates, occasionally jumping back to the people at the bus stop to whom he's telling his life story. That is a flawed approach in my book. Famous movies with constant lead narration. You can do it effectively and ineffectively. The Usual Suspects, a movie I just watched and really enjoyed, so this is indeed the second time I'm referencing it this episode, American Psycho, and Fight Club. 3 well-known, well-respected movies that came out around the same time as Forrest Gump, a time when it seems like narration was all the rage, 2 of which are based on books, and all 3 of which I have seen and enjoyed more than this dumb movie. And I don't really love Fight Club. Now, so to avoid a 10-minute tangent, I will quickly break down the 3 ways these separate movies use narration via the main character without taking away from my enjoyment. 1. An unreliable narrator. Someone who gives you half the truth or straight up lies. So rather than just telling you a story, they are sending you on a journey of twists and turns where you slowly unwrap situations and characters. You have to work out someone's motivation. You have to piece together clues to figure out what actually happened, from more than the one perspective given. 2. Insight and flavor. I want to know what this character's take is from this situation. Why are they telling me this? Why are they telling me this in this way? How could someone perceive this part differently? How does a human being process and understand a situation? Which leads into 3, the internal monologue. The only way I really think narration should be used, unless it is an interrogation type situation. It's kind of similar to insight, except this isn't a character explaining a situation to us. This is their thought process. No glossing over things or slanting truth. What does Patrick Bateman think when he sees that business card? Not what does he want others or the viewers to think he feels. What is he hiding from the outside world that we get to glimpse at because it's just his line of thought? When Verbal explains to the officers, he embellishes a lot, and we have to piece together alongside the cops what actually went down San Pedro Harbor. The narrator in Fight Club gives a slightly more straightforward rundown of what happened, but he's a fucked up guy who adds or keeps parts out of the story without even realizing. In Forrest Gump, we see a thing happen, and then, so the movie doesn't have to try very hard, Forrest explains in slightly more detail what is indeed happening. In surface level ways, he sometimes explains why something's happening or how he felt, but those are rare and never very interesting. I just mentioned that 2 of those movies with good narration were based on books, which makes sense. Books are long. Narration can assist with moving the story along while still working on your character and showing their arc. But a movie is not a book, in that a movie is meant to do what a book cannot. To show and not tell, in the most literal sense. The music, lighting, setting, tone, and visual quality all work together to assist a character and the dialogue to tell a story, convey an emotion, and engage an audience. Forrest Gump isn't good at any of those things, especially when it comes to conveying emotion. I cannot tell you how many times I wanted to feel while watching this movie and couldn't, because the tone or the music or the scene transition didn't let me. I think the worst example of this is when Bubba dies in Vietnam and the scene transitions from Tom Hanks clutching his dead friend to him walking around the hospital talking about how he comically got shot in the ass. I, as someone who knows very little about movie making, was aghast at this wasted opportunity for a heartstring kind of movie to get some tears out of their audience, because when it comes down to it, that's what this movie is. A tearjerker, a heartwarming movie you watch to take your mind off things. It's not a masterpiece. It doesn't push the boundaries of film. It doesn't inspire the American public. And yet, a lot of people have called it one of the best American movies ever made, along with Gone with the Wind and Star Wars and Casablanca and Apocalypse Now. And it doesn't make sense to me. I don't know. I think it's like how Hollywood loves to give the Oscar for Best Picture to a movie about old Hollywood. Americans love references to their history. They see Elvis's dance and JFK as president and ping pong diplomacy, and they say, I know that thing, I like that thing. And they get excited. But I don't like it. I didn't appreciate it, and I did not enjoy it. Also, the thing mentioned at the very beginning of the movie about how he was named after a former leader of the KKK. That was added to the movie, it was not in the book. Which just seems like a weird, dumb, unnecessary decision that immediately villainizes his mother, who I was not able to like at any point in this movie. Whatever, I also think this movie's sexist, but it's the 90s, and I've already talked about a movie being sexist for far too long in my Marriage Story review. So, I do not recommend this movie. Everyone should instead go watch My Bodyguard 1980. It's my favorite movie right now. It's about a kid who hires a taller kid to be his bodyguard. It's great. Real heartwarming stuff, real tear-jerking moments. 10 out of 10. Thank you. Bye-bye.